Thank you to everyone who has been supporting the Time Talks podcast. Thank you to Awareness for the music. This episode features Andrea Pitzer, who is an amazing journalist, researcher, and writer. Her first book was A Secret History of Vladimir Nabokov. Today I'm speaking to Andrea Pitzer about her latest book, One Long Night, A Global History of Concentration Camps. One Long Night is written with a historical narrative angle to the history of concentration camps. It is a story of prisoners that follows them through concentration camps in Cuba, Philippines, the Boer Wars in South Africa, the Russian Gulag, Germany's Shark Island concentration camp in what is now Namibia, Nazi camps such as Auschwitz, British concentration camps in Kenya, Japanese concentration camps in California, the Dirty Wars in Argentina, camps in Chile from the U.S.-backed coup on September 11, 1973, and Guantanamo Bay, where prisoners continue to be indefinitely detained. I speak to Andrea about the recent prison strikes, resistance in concentration camps in history, the treatment of Native Americans that inspired Hitler's policies, the current crisis of children being separated from their families at the border, and the rise of fascism. We jump right in discussing why Andrea Pitzer wrote this book.
And you had written this because it was kind of it was the gap that you saw, right, when you were working on the Nabokov?
Right, exactly. When I was doing the Nabokov project, his brother had died. His younger brother, Sergei, had died in a German concentration camp in the north called Neuengamme, and I had gone there for a couple days to just do research on what his life there would have been like. And the camps came up again and again in Nabokov's book just because he was born right with the 20th century. He was born in 1899, and was the way that these camps had come into the world, and how did this start? How did the idea of a concentration camp start? And I looked around and I found one French book that's a little more of an encyclopedia than sort of a how did this happen, but and was very focused on a lot of the communist camp systems called Le Siècle des Camps, and it was basically a century of camps. But I did get to use that in my own book, but there wasn't anything in English, and I didn't find anything that sort of had the narrative of how these things evolved over time and shifted and expanded, and, you know, how our understanding of them changed.
Yeah, well, I'm so glad that you wrote this book, because the book is really refreshing, and the way you write is amazing. I can definitely tell that you're a fan of literature. And my first question really ties into this, because I've been a journalist since I was 20. I'm 33 now. And I was wondering of how you use narrative journalism and how do you approach history differently?
Well, I think that there are lots of legitimate ways to write history, and there's also a lot of illegitimate ways, I think. Luckily, it's not my job to be the decider for everybody. I just have to decide for myself. And for myself, I think you can make even dense and depressing and difficult, and it doesn't really get more dense and depressing and difficult than 100 years of concentration camps on 6 continents. You know, you can get across that material much more effectively and much more powerfully if you use storytelling techniques. I think the danger is that you just sort of wallow in storytelling techniques and don't use them for any purpose, and that might still get readers to read it, but it was important to me that I wanted to use the stories of these prisoners in camps in alternating sections with sort of the deeper, broader history, you know, that goes beyond just one person's account. I wanted to use both elements because if I just used the personal stories and didn't explain how it happened or why it mattered or any of that, then it would just be using these people to get an emotional effect, and it would be just kind of a voyeurism. But if something in their stories sort of sheds light on a greater phenomenon, adds up to something else, then I think, you know, they become a legitimate and useful part of the story. So there could have just been sort of a dry academic text, which would have had its benefits and but wouldn't have reached as many people, or it could have just been a bunch of stories from people's existences in the camp, which I think would do them a little bit of a disservice. I didn't want to sort of force them into my narrative. Some of them don't fit super cleanly. Some of them, you know, are outliers. I didn't want to, there's a word, in doing this kind of work called instrumentalizing them. I didn't want to just use them as objects in my narrative. I kind of wanted the messiness of their situations to come across too, because camps are a really messy thing, and when you're using narrative techniques, you can't just manipulate everything to sort of fit the story that you already want to tell. You have to deal with the reality. And so I thought by having the academic reality and the personal subjective experiences, people would get both the big picture and the very small, intimate picture of what it was like to be in the camps as well.
Yeah, and I really like how you would pin these stories back down with primary sources or these laws that were being passed at the same time, which was just perfect.
Well, and I think because that's one experience of the camps, and I think it was important not to lose sight of it. These were the people who actually suffered and in many cases died there, although I focused the book on people who had survived to sort of make it more readable and possible to read the thing. But that isn't the only reality that happened. There's also the reality of the people who were doing this to other people. There was also the reality of what the world understood at the time. And so as much as I could, I wanted to try to fit all that in, what was the whole idea of a camp at the time for people who lived in them, for people who approved of them, for people who fought against them. What was this idea that in the world? I think in the introduction near the end of it, I mentioned the sort of how I think of the book, which is it's a biography of a bad idea. And I wanted to sort of as complete a biography in one volume as I could do.
Well, this leads me to my next question about how this book is a story of prisoners. And I was wondering whose story kind of intrigued you the most, and also what do you make of the recent prison strikes that started last week?
Well, I think that there is this idea that camps or prisons just have this kind of inevitability, and that they're just these things that have always existed and that they always will exist. And while they might always exist going forward, they didn't always exist. The mass prison phenomenon and the concentration camp phenomenon are relatively recent in human history. For a lot of different reasons. People used to just exile whole groups of people, which was awful in its own way. People just used to kill prisoners often. But this idea of keeping people alive and confined, is fairly new, but it's become, we think, particularly in the U.S., which is how I think we end up with this prison strike that's just underway now. We tend to think of it as this isolated, segregated part of society, and that's certainly part of its goal. But it's really become an integral part of American society. I mean, our rates of incarceration are just staggering. And that's a little bit separate from the camp phenomenon, because I really tried to, it was already such a big story, I tried to limit it to mass detention of civilians without trial, usually on the basis of race or ethnicity or political association or religious belief. And so it was, I tried to have some boundaries around it because it could sort of flow everywhere. But those are a little bit artificially installed, and I want to say things like some of the detention facilities we have where people are held for incredibly long periods, sometimes longer than a year, without actually getting to trial. There are gray areas that bleed from one area into the next, and so the prison strike that's going on I don't think is entirely separate from the whole camp phenomenon, even though prisons are generally speaking for people who have been sentenced by trial. Now, there's all kinds of prison abuses, and there's all kinds of systemic trial abuses, lack of adequate counsel, abuse by guards within the facilities. There's a lot of factors that you can see that relate to things that have happened in the camp system too. And so there is kind of this fuzzy line. But for purposes of just talking with you today about the book, I think the important thing to keep in mind is that we often take away a sense of humanity from people when we put them into any kind of long-term detention. And I think that it not only does a disservice to them, perhaps one that they don't deserve, even if they've done some pretty terrible things, but it does a tremendous disservice to society, particularly when we have so many people incarcerated. We have to understand how to move these people back into society and to avoid detaining as many people as we do.
Yeah, and I think that's really what your book does, is give these people a voice and really rehumanizes them.
Well, and I think it's one of those things, we're living in a time where, unfortunately, we have more perspective on this than maybe we would have a decade ago as a society, because I think 10 years ago, people would have had a really hard time picturing Nazis running somebody down with a car at a parade, at a rally in March in Charlottesville. They would have had a hard time seeing sort of the public stances of actual neo-Nazis. And then people who seem to not be very interested in dissociating themselves with neo-Nazis. We have some elected representatives who are regularly on social media posting and retweeting things from people who directly embrace this, ideology. And so where 10 years ago it might have been hard to picture how could Nazi Germany happen, I think today we can see that, which is not at all to say that, we are in the middle of a Holocaust or, Auschwitz was this very singular moment and the death camps that accompanied it too. But if we're looking at things like 1931, 1932, 1933, right as the Nazis are beginning to rise to power and then sort of sealing that rise in 33, we are seeing related phenomenon today. And I use the Nazi example often because it's the only one people know from camp history. They don't know about how the Gulag started, and they don't know about how camps in Chile or Argentina or Vietnam started. And so the Nazi one is an easy one to fall back to. But I don't want to be suggesting that Trump is Hitler and that we're in the middle of Auschwitz. Is more, I'm interested in this system of ideas. How does language that says it's okay to brutalize other people, to use government forces to do harm to other people, how does that enter the world? How do people start to accept that? What kind of rationales do you have to use to sort of train people both to commit these acts, but also the larger group you need that has to be willing to go along with them? And I think we're in the middle of some of that now. And the great news is we're democracy. People could go out in the street tomorrow and stop anything the government is doing. The government's not going to come out with machine guns and mow them down. Certainly African-American protests and Black Lives Matter have met with some real institutional resistance. But if the general population of the U.S. hit the streets tomorrow, let's say as they did in South Korea, to protest the president, there's nothing that would stop them. And so we aren't in the dire straits that most people were in as these camp systems arose, because we have so many options available to us. Yet at the same time, we can see the dynamics of how it happens and how it could even happen here in the States. It's a terrible but fascinating moment to be in the middle of.
Yeah, and your book really provides us good hindsight towards that, to diagnose these things. My next question was, what are some inspiring stories of resistance you found in your research? I found the circuses were really interesting that appeared in these camps. I believe it was in Germany and also in Chile or Argentina.
It was Chile, yes. I
Okay.
met a guy who would. So just first overall to talk about this idea of resistance. People resisted on amazing levels. There were so many. I gave a whole talk here in Northern Virginia at a library on just the resistance that was in the camps, because it occurred on so many levels, and people think of those in the camps as helpless and passive and not doing anything, and they were certainly brutalized. The death camps killed, just untold numbers of people in this direct form of extermination, even in those camps, and definitely at tremendous different levels because they had more options in other camps. You see people resisting from the very standpoint of sometimes switching prisoner identities. You have if it were advantageous, if some guy died unexpectedly and another guy was in trouble, they might switch identities to let that other guy who was still alive off the hook for his trouble and then quickly burn or bury the other person, so that because prisoners were in charge of so many of the daily activities of running the camp, they had to, just the size of them in many systems required prisoners to do a lot of the work of it, which gave them not opportunities necessarily for massive resistance, although you did see sometimes people blowing things up, burning things down, rioting. In the Gulag system, there were strikes and riots. In Nazi camps, there were uprisings, and at some points there were escapes. And so you see the really radical end of that I think sort of works against this idea of these prisoners as just helpless, passive victims. But on the small levels, people tried to keep their humanity. They tried to reinvent themselves. They tried to create, which is such a fundamental human impulse. And so there was artwork that was done in the camp, sometimes to document what had happened. In other cases, literally just an aesthetic attempt to still have some kind of joy or beautiful experience. A lot of prisoners didn't have time for that, but where they had just a little bit of time, they would do lectures for each other. Where there was some room made through international sort of pressure to be treating the prisoners better, you would find them putting on plays. You would find them requesting sewing machines, and they would sew dolls, and the Catholic Church in Chile would sell these dolls and give the proceeds to the families of the people who were imprisoned. And so just these complicated networks of creating things, of sort of just refusing this lot in life that had been dealt to them. Even people who weren't necessarily politically active found all these outlets and often helped who they could. And of course the camps reduced people to animals in many other settings, and I don't think we can judge them from our position, which is so many more options available to us. So certainly terrible things prisoners did to each other in the camps as well, but the number of people who in the face of this kind of horrors resisted was staggering to me. And the theme you mentioned, which is circuses, was really interesting because it just came up randomly. None of the people I talked to had known about other people who were doing it. It was just a reflective response, and the ludicrousness of the situation demanded almost a ludicrous answer. And so in some of the early, you wouldn't have been able to do this in the later German camps, but in some of the early German camps in the 30s in the north, a lot of which were really focused on forced labor. You had people setting up, professional actors and musicians setting up concentrazioni, like circus concentration. I'm trying to think of how you'd even paraphrase it. But it was, and they had a sandwich board they made, and they had a prisoner walk around the compound wearing it to advertise it. And guards came, and prison officials came. And the guy I spoke to in Chile was sort of wonderful. They were held on a boat, and one of the prisoners that was there with him, his father-in-law was the captain of the boat, and it felt terrible for them because in Chile it had happened through a sort of a military coup, and that's why they were detained, was part of this sudden military dictatorship that took over. And so the captain of the ship felt terrible for the prisoners, but he had been ordered to do this. So he was holding them, but they requested these materials from him, ribbons and papers and streamers, and they put on this circus, and they put it on every week after they were moved off the boat, after they were moved into long-term facilities, and the man I interviewed became the director of the circus. And one week he got in trouble, and he was in solitary confinement. And the guys who put on the talent that put on the circus refused to perform until he was released. And so that was the only week during his whole detention that they didn't have that circus. And so on the one hand, I don't want to diminish this and make it sound like it was summer camp, the way that some of the border camps in the U.S. have been described lately. But in every camp system, in every camp system in which people were not immediately fed off the trains into extermination facilities, there was downtime. There were small windows in which everyday things would occur, and people tried to seize their humanity in those moments. And I think it's very inspirational how they've managed to do it.
Yeah, those stories are amazing. Wow. Well, my next question, I want to go back now to the precedent of concentration camps that you speak about in One Long Night. And you say legally going to the Lieber Code of Conduct was adopted by the U.S. Army in 1863. You write that Lieber's Code after the Civil War was almost entirely adopted by Germany, and it laid the groundwork for international law going into The Hague in 1899 and Geneva Convention in 1906. Can you speak about this precedent that this has set?
Sure, and I try to trace sort of the historical roots. So I don't think we can say that this code used by the U.S. military starting in the middle of the Civil War is responsible for concentration camps. But I wanted to show how even attempts sometimes to do the right thing have unforeseen consequences, and how the ways in which we put policy in certain arenas tends to bleed over into other arenas. So basically this code was adopted, and part of its goal was to make sure war would be more humane, to make sure people would treat each other better, to set some rules around the conduct of war. But it was really one of the first attempts to do so, and so of course it had a lot of gaps in it. And by institutionalizing that some things weren't okay, it almost had the implicit effect of other things being allowed because they hadn't been included in the first versions of this stuff. And so we get from Liber to Geneva and Hague, especially the influences stronger on the Hague, but there were some intermediate steps. There were some governments that adopted it. There were some talks about other things, but the line of influence is definitely very strong there. And so what happened was there was very little attention paid to how civilians might eventually be held. There was a lot of attention paid to how are we going to treat prisoners of war and what are the rules around treating prisoners of war a certain way. But aside from just some general guidelines for how we would protect citizens, there wasn't a lot of attention paid to how non-combatants would be treated. The Liber Code talks a little bit about it, but basically says that if they're impeding the war, then you can do some bad things. And so people took that really liberally. And at one point there was an order during the Civil War to detain all military-age males in an entire part of Virginia because it was assumed that they would be or already were fighting for the Confederacy. And so this idea that you were just going to round them all up and hold them, even though it was understood that they were non-combatants, set a very bad precedent that got cited by other people later. But part of what you have is this idea that by being included marginally in these texts, but their rights not being addressed, that civilians became part of the tools of war. And so you saw in the U.S. Civil War and you saw in Europe in the second half of the 19th century this idea of total war emerging, in which you want to have citizens suffering in order to force an earlier end to the war. And that became a real part of war strategy. After the Civil War, the U.S. Civil War, there also became this idea of unconditional surrender being how war ought to be handled. And so to get to that point, you really have to make the population suffer to want their fighters to end the war, to put pressure on it from that side as well. And so this embrace of total war led to militaries, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, wanting to do harm to civilians. And obviously they couldn't just wholesale go slaughtering civilians without really bad public relations out of it. And at that point, the beginnings of international law, asking some questions. But what they could do was they could detain them, and they could say they were detaining them for military purposes. And so what you see evolve at the very end of the 19th century in Cuba, the last few years of the century, are this idea of sweeping all civilians in a contested area into concentration camps. And that's what they're called in that moment. That's sort of when the phrase is born. And so it's understood that many of them won't have done anything. There's always a suspicion that some of them are aiding the enemy, but the military need to control that territory is seen as outweighing their rights. And those first camps, the first several decades of camps in most locations, were really about this kind of detention. But the death rates were horrific because there weren't adequate resources put toward planning the camps in advance. And so you had not enough food, you had crops burned, so nobody had anything to eat, and you had poorly sited places, and so that many of them were built on swampy land. And when you enclose people like that without food, disease just becomes incredibly rampant. So you had about 150,000 people dying in Cuba, which was a tremendously large part of the population at that time. And it wasn't because they were being shot in the camps; it was because they were getting infectious diseases and they were starving to death.
Yeah, those accounts you write about are just horrific. And then when we see that when the U.S. goes into the Philippines with General Jacob Smith saying to turn it into, as you write, a howling wilderness, as he said, it really just flips that whole contradiction into the Philippines. Well,
it's amazing because the original title of the book was going to be The Wilderness and the Grave, and that's part of a quote that the President McKinley said to authorize U.S. entry into the Spanish-American War in 1898. Part of the justification that he used was that this idea of reconcentration, as it was called then, was not war by any civilized means. It was extermination, and it would beget no peace but that of the wilderness and the grave. So when the U.S. went in to fight Spain and Cuba, it understood very well the horrors of concentration camps. And that's why a lot of the American public was, after the sinking of the Maine, ready to go to war very quickly. We had seen pictures of these camps and heard accounts of them. We'd been sending food, beans and condensed milk, and all this stuff by ships down there to help the starving prisoners. And so America had this very clear idea. It was a very moral mission that we went in with. There were definitely some business interests. There were hemispheric interests. There were definitely other things at play. But the moral authority to go in was real. When we went into Cuba and fought Spain, that there was a legitimate concern that we needed to do something because all these people were dying. But it's ironic that we go from, one of the most heroic American actions in that period to 2 years later. Actually, I think it's like 3 years later. After we've defeated Spain, we inherited the Spanish possessions, most of them, and one of those was the Philippines, and we inherited this conflict there that they were seeking independence as well. And about 3 years later, in response to that conflict, we instituted our own concentration camps, very much along the same model, this time with torture as part of our larger policy there, not so much directly in the camps, but as part of our military policy as well. And it's sort of a horrible irony that we go from being the sort of heroic actor on this one side to then imposing this on the other side, because we're facing the same problem that Spain had faced in Cuba, and so we tried the same answer. And I think that it's a good reminder that any system, some people have asked me, are communist societies or democratic societies, who's more prone to doing this kind of thing? And the answer is everybody is prone to it. It unfolds differently, sort of based on local characteristics and the political system that it happens in. But any political system is capable of using this kind of detention. And so that's one of the sadder realities that I found while writing the book.
Mm-hmm. And you really speak about how it's politically made and people have to be coached to go into these.
Absolutely. That is the good news, is that the downside is it can happen anywhere. The upside is that there are definitely political systems that make it easier to undo. And another upside is that it isn't just human nature. People don't inevitably do this. In fact, one of the challenges of running long-term camp systems has been developing systems in which you can harden a group of people to be willing to do this to their fellow countrymen and women. And so I think we can take some reassurance in the idea that it usually takes years of propaganda. It takes government embrace of this. It takes, social pressure that's created to conform to a party, and also, for the people who are actually carrying out these actions to be willing to do it. And so it isn't something generally that can happen overnight, but it is something that can happen when you have a group that's been demonized, when you have a group that is seen as legitimate to treat this way. And, this is why I think, particularly right now in the U.S., we have some things to be worried about. The book, I turned the book in 2016, and it came out in 2017, and I spent part of the last chapter looking at Guantanamo because I was, and I still am, concerned about us having this long-term detention without trial sitting sort of right offshore, that we're coming up on, in a few months, on 17 years that it's been there. So that's a long legal history to have existing as a precedent. And then since the book went to print, and I actually have done an update of like an addendum at the back of it, an afterword that talks about these border camps that we've set up this year and how those both rise out of prior detention camp history that the U.S. has, but also sort of reflect a new twist on what we're willing to do at this point. And these are the kinds of things that you see during that phase where people learn to accept extrajudicial detention, the idea that you can just lock a whole bunch of people up because you find them suspicious or problematic, even if it means violating legal rights that they have internationally or at home. And I think as Americans, we should be very worried about this. And I think that I hope that people will be paying attention.
Well, I wanted to talk about Namibia now. So you spoke about how Philip Sheridan had encouraged Prussian forces to use devastating force in the Franco-Prussian War. And then after the scramble for Africa, where Europe further colonized the continent. This led to the often not spoke about German genocide of the Herero and Nama in Namibia, then known as German Southwest Africa. Can you speak about the precedent this set for Nazi Germany and the death camps? And I believe Göring even served in German Southwest Africa.
So I'm glad you asked that, because I think that one of the ideas that sometimes happens is, for instance, the Nazis, when they were on trial, would often say, well, we were inspired by the Soviets, and they did it first, and so we didn't do anything that hadn't already been done, and they should be on trial too, if this is how we're going to do it. And that's not how it happened. That those were two sort of separate phenomenon, and they knew about each other, and there may have been some individual level tiny crossovers at various points, but the Gulag didn't inspire the Nazi Holocaust. And I think sometimes that same argument is made with Namibia or Southwest Africa, as it was then known, and what the Germans did there, and then what happened later with the Nazis. And I think I don't think it's a directly causal thing. And so just basically so people know what happened, there were rebellious indigenous people in Southwest Africa who had sort of lived a unstable but negotiated peace for a time, and then that got thrown into conflict again. And then in that moment, there was a general who took over and basically said that we're going to exterminate all these people and put out a proclamation. This was independent of the Reichstag at the time. There was some sense that these policies were known at the higher levels of the emperor, but the Reichstag itself had not approved this. And when they learned about what was happening there, they were horrified, and they started cutting funding on the war. And so while it was definitely an attempt to eliminate the rebellious Herero and Nama people, and then by extension the Herero and Nama people as a whole for a period of time, I mean, it's definitely genocidal behavior, no doubt about that. But I think that German society was not necessarily supporting that, was not necessarily embracing and driving that, although definitely the imperial forces they had trained and set loose in the colonies had been given all kinds of power and all kinds of resources to do just these kinds of things. And so that's not excusing anything, but I think when we get to the Nazis, it's a whole different level of intention and organization and planning that takes over the entire country, takes over Europe. So we see it in the links that we do see it happening with are, I think, this eugenics idea that rises with Galton and then in the U.S., and this idea of sterilizing people, and that there's this hierarchy of races, and that some people are sort of more intelligent or more human than other people. That infects both, because we see that in some of the research on skulls and tribes and things that was done in Southwest Africa very directly, and we see it later in Nazi Germany applied the same way. So this is a eugenic thread that's running through the whole world in that moment that excuses seeing other regions and groups of people sort of through this lens. But I think it's a little dangerous to say that what the Southwest Africa campaigns did directly influenced Nazi Germany, because I think there's sort of a rupture that happens. In the first 10 years of concentration camp history, it happens out in these outlying colonies. It happens in Cuba. It happens in the Philippines. It happens in the Boer War in southern Africa, right next door to what is Namibia today. And then it happens with the Germans, where we've just been discussing in Southwest Africa. These are all pretty far-flung, but they do actually get coverage. There is actually public outrage over this, and concentration camps are seen as brutal things that barbaric societies run. There's a huge backlash. And after that first 10 years, their use becomes much more problematic. They're used smaller versions and quietly when they're used, and they almost come off the face of the earth because their toll is seen as so horrific, and that is just almost ungentlemanly and inhuman to impose this kind of thing on civilians. And it isn't until World War I, so there's almost a rupture in concentration camp history. It isn't until World War I where there, for various reasons, there are many people, there are many countries at war, and there are many people, let's say Germans living in England when war breaks out between England and Germany. And so what do you do with those people? In the past, you would have just had them give their word that they wouldn't be involved in the conflict, or you would have sent them home. But two things had changed. One was that almost everybody, all the major players in the conflict, had turned to universal involvement in war. So if you were a military-age male, you were expected to serve. And so that kind of conscription just became very widespread. So if they sent you home to your home country was going to send you back in a uniform. And they thought, well, that's not a good idea. And rather than letting those people be there and just give their word, which was how it had been done in more prior conflicts that had been widespread, there was this existing idea in the ether of, well, what about concentration camps? And so in World War I, you see the globalization of concentration camps. And they did it because they thought they could do it sort of more humanely. They were thinking, well, we would do it, but we would do it nicer than those awful camps that were a decade ago. And so they created these camps, and in fact, they did, for the most part, there were exceptions, of course, they ran them sort of more human. And this is where they were called concentration camps at the time, but now we would call them internment camps. This is where the idea of internment comes from. And it was all over the world. And it's that idea that creates the bureaucracy of getting people to register and turn themselves in. How do you house large groups of civilians? How do you organize them? How are the camps run? I think it's those World War I camps in Germany that become very instructive on how the Nazi camps rise. I think that's actually more the model, and it's why people didn't question it so much early on. I mean, this was an existing phenomenon that came to be seen as very normal, in part because those World War I camps hadn't had the horrific death tolls. And so some people have made, there are some scholars who have made an argument that the links between Southwest Africa and Namibia and the Nazis are very close. And I would say there's a scattershot, small number of influences, but I see those World War I camps as being the beginning of almost everything that the average person thinks of when they think of a concentration camp. You know, the long barracks and the barbed wire, although there was certainly barbed wire there from the beginning with the camps, but the big sort of military-style encampments, that all rises out of World War I. And that's how you get the Gulag and the Nazis not that far apart in time, but not with the Gulag influencing the Nazis, but rather they both rose out of this architecture that had been put in place starting in 1914.
Thank you for elaborating on that. And I think you already tied into what I was going to ask next about U.S. policy inspiration for the Nazis tied in with eugenics and then also U.S. history. As you write, Hitler had rationalized the removal of populations in Eastern Europe by making analogies to the eradication of Native Americans from North America. And then you write about this note that he put in these Karl May Wild West novels, saying the struggle we are waging there against the partisans resembles very much the struggle in North America against the Red Indians.
Yes, and so I think this is a very odd corner of history that, like, not a lot of people know about, although certainly historians have gone through it in detail. But those early camps, those early Nazi camps were modeled very much on the World War I internment camps. But once the war starts, those camps have been around for several years and have sort of given them room to maneuver and become creative and do new things with camps. So the Central Nazis add whole other layers on what camps are and they can become, both because they operate them for a long time and because they have so many of them. You find a lot of variation and a lot of invention that happens. And as they head into World War II, up until that point, it really is that if you go into these camps, you come out. There are certainly abuses. There are certainly people who are killed in them. I don't want to minimize them. They're really bad places. But the overwhelming majority of people who go in return home at some point. And so it isn't until the Nazi forces have such tremendous success heading eastward. You know, they're heading westward, of course. They're dominating Western Europe. France is falling. All these other things are happening. But when they start heading eastward, when Russia goes from being an ally to them beginning the invasion, they're traveling through, even before Russia actually, you know, at first they divide part of Eastern Europe, and so they're moving through that, and then after that they're driving right into Russia as well. they're capturing so many people, they're moving through so much new territory and populations that they have to deal with. And in Germany, the Jewish population was less than 2%. And so it was always a very small minority that they were trying to address. You know, and the Gypsy population was also not what we would now call Roma and Sinti populations were not huge either. So they were trying to manage a very small part of their population. But once they start moving eastward, they're moving through whole regions that are majority Jewish, you know, Polish towns and places. And so, and they have so many, when the Soviet operation begins, they have so many Soviet prisoners of war. There is no simple answer. They cannot simply just stick all these people easily in camps. They can't be mobile. They can't do everything they need to do to sustain this two-front war. And so they clearly are trying to figure it out. And Hitler at that point is very much inspired by Native American reservations and treatment in the U.S., in North America. And this idea, the romance of the Western, and Carmyle was a hugely influential, just in terms of sales alone, novelist. And he's incredibly popular in Germany. And so it was a cultural touchstone that regular Germans could understand and turn to. And I don't think it's an accident that you see then what Germany turns to, replicating some of the things that the U.S. had done in dealing with Native American populations. For a while, they were going to put Eastern European Jews offshore on an island. I think it was Madagascar at one point. There were all these ideas. They were floating all these tremendous number of ideas. And at first, it really was just going to be basically put them on reservations even farther east and have them do forced labor. But the sheer numbers became just untenable. And I don't want to, I'm obviously simplifying very complex and important history just for the purposes of us being able to talk about it here. There are a lot of different things that are happening. But you do see Hitler openly thinking about that history. And earlier, he had openly thought about and referred to World War I detention in internment camps that people had had, that Germans had had. He talked about the Boer camps. So he tapped into all these traditions as he and the people who worked with him thought about what to do. And of course, in the end, what they chose was outright genocide. You know, and this was their addition to the concentration camp sort of evolution, the lexicon of possibilities, was this ultimate horror, which is what if we made these camps simply about the mass eradication of a people as quickly and efficiently as possible. And that was done in part because the killings in the fields where, you know, there would be mass graves dug and people would be shot at the side of the graves was proving too traumatic for the soldiers. And so it was partly what we were talking about before, that you really do have to train people to it, and you do have to inoculate them from some of the worst of it to even get them to be able to carry these things out. And it turned out that industrializing it with gas chambers was one path to that.
And you're speaking about after when Himmler had witnessed like 100 executions of Jewish peoples. Right, and the account was that he was standing there and some rain spattered up the side of his clothing, and that he had been worried about the mental health, not of course of the prisoners, which would be the human thing, but of the executioners. And there had been a number of different things already being tried. This is where I talked about some of the variability. There had been a number of things already being tried in different German camps and in German society with euthanizing and executing people. There was the idea of having them think they were going in for a doctor's office, and they would stand up to be measured for their height, and there was a hole in the wall, and somebody behind the wall would see when that hole was covered up, they would know the person was there ready to shoot, and they would basically shoot them in the back of the head. And that could be done fairly quickly and efficiently, but it was still one-on-one. And there were ways in which the developmentally disabled and differently able people were targeted for extermination as well, but on a sort of more of a case-by-case kind of basis at that time. But they did have squads that would be trained to do this. But ultimately, that kind of individual killing lost out to this ability to simultaneously kill large groups of people, and in a way that also allowed distance between the executioners and the people that they were killing. Well, I'd like to move to Argentina now, and you write, in a birthing room upstairs, pregnant prisoners delivered more than 4,000 babies who were taken from prisoners and given to associates of the junta, of its officers, and raised as their own. And I was really interested in when you wrote about the abuelas de Plaza de Mayo, the grandmothers of the babies, and they used DNA technology to prove their cases. And I see parallels with the U.S. supporting this dirty war and their foreign policy in Argentina, and what is now happening and was or is now still happening at the border with children being separated from parents and sent away. Can you speak on these?
Sure. Well, I think there's sort of two things happening. One is the U.S. border detentions in which we separated families sort of as a deliberately punitive policy to try to serve as a deterrent. I mean, we've seen John Kelly quoted, in 2017 talking about the consideration of that. And so, it wasn't an accident. I mean, it was a deliberate thing. And so it's important to keep that in mind. And I do try to focus in the book on the camps because it's this discrete moment where barbed wire becomes available, this phrase arises, these are called concentration camps. But they do have roots going further back. And so before I talk about Argentina, I do want to say that even though there are some very small distinctions between overall the Native American reservations and then concentration camps that arise a little bit later, the U.S. has a really long history of splitting up families of people that are second-class citizens or seen as less than human. We saw it during the slave trade. We saw it with Native American reservations and kids being forced off to school or forced into work. This question of what we can do to people who aren't fully citizens, because slaves weren't fully citizens. They had a slave status, then for a brief time during the whole question of what would happen to their rights after this, between the Emancipation Proclamation and some of the amendments that took care of the issue. They were denizens. Native Americans these people never had full rights as U.S. citizens. And that's where we got the power to split up their families. And so that's what we're seeing. So we don't have to necessarily look abroad to see this tradition having played out here before. But I do think in this context of this mass civilian detention that we're talking about with these camps, it's helpful to look at some of these other cases. And in those situations, there was also a deliberate effort to sort of punish families and take these children from the women. Now, the women were often killed who had been held this way. Argentina sort of streamlined their efforts. They held fewer people than, let's say, Chile did, but they killed a higher rate of the people that they held. And so many of these women weren't around to raise their children anymore, but again, instead of returning the children to the families, they gave them to members of the junta or their supporters. And those children were raised by them. And actually, even during the military dictatorship, it wasn't possible for the powers that be to arrest all the grandmas, though. So the grandmas came out as this organization, the abuelas, and they would demonstrate in front of the palace in Buenos Aires. And I actually went and met with some of them when I was there. Because they're still active. They still haven't found all the grandchildren. And for a long time it was very difficult because even if they thought they had found somebody, they couldn't prove it. They would try to prove it through records of where had this child come from that this family had, but it's very difficult to prove that this child actually belongs to this other family, not the family it had been raised with. And so it wasn't until more than a decade later when DNA technology started becoming, even possible, and now when it's a little more ubiquitous and simpler to use, that they could actually have those children tested, and that courts would become sympathetic to demanding these tests where there appeared to be questions of, what had happened and where had this child actually, who were the biological parents of this child. And so now it was almost like they had to go for years just sort of protesting in a void before they actually got the political tools because of the change of power, and then the scientific tools that would make it both, somebody willing to and then possible to determine the children's real identity. And I suspect, we don't know exactly how this border camp situation is going to play out yet, but I suspect given that they deported several of the parents already, those parents may or may not be reachable. They may be in hiding. They may or may not be willing to come back to the U.S. if they think it's a trick, because they may have already been, it sounds like several of the cases we've heard, people were told their daughter or son was being taken to a shower or being taken to play or some other thing, and then the child was just taken away. So they might or might not even return to the U.S. to get their child because they might or may not believe that they could. I suspect we are going to have some of these children that will not be reunited with their biological parents, and the likelihood is that they'll be adopted. They'll go through some foster care situation, and then we'll have U.S. families adopting them. And so it's definitely not quite the same as Argentina in terms of the intent, but in the outcome, you still have children of a detained, powerless, targeted group whose parents are punished by the children being taken away, adopted by probably members of the dominant society. So even if it's not as widespread, even if it doesn't involve mass executions as it did in Argentina, I don't think this is a history that it becomes us to repeat. And so while it's not exactly the same, the echoes are bad enough.
Mm-hmm. Well, staying on that topic, I was really interested when you wrote about the 1919 diagnosis of barbed wire disease. And I was recently listening to Mona Hanna-Attisha, who's a pediatrician, and she was speaking about toxic stress and these children who are being reunited with their parents or not being reunited at the border, that they're suffering from this toxic stress. And are there parallels you see with this?
Well, I think we can see some pretty direct parallels, not just on the border, but Australia has had this policy of offshoring refugees and not letting them onshore, and basically bargaining with other places and paying for their detention there. So we've created these camps like Nauru. They've created these camps. I think we as humanity have created them, but Australia specifically has created them, in which you see this kind of toxic stress. And any kind of new, diagnostic name for things, I think we have to be cautious about. It's easy to just make big generalizations. But in some of these cases, children stop eating, they sleep. They basically go into a semi-coma type of sleep. They just simply become unable to function. And I think that there's little doubt that, of course, for them, the separation from their parents is just about the most profound thing you can do to any child, particularly during the early developmental years. But along with that, this sort of endless detention in which there's no hope that it will resolve, you have no power, it has nothing to do with anything you've done, and you can't do anything to change your situation. I think of what you'd even call them. Those just landscape, situations that they're in, even if, as some people have described these camps, as these border camps, as summer camps, and they have all these activities, and certainly it's better if they have things to do than not things to do. So I'm not putting down that we should provide them services. We should be providing all kinds of services for them. We shouldn't detain them in the first place, but if we're going to, we need to have a positive environment for them. But having a positive environment doesn't do anything to address the biggest sources of the stress that they're facing, which is the separation from the families and the lack of any sense of when anything's going to change, when they're going to be with somebody who's going to take care of them, when they'll be in a family structure, when their detentions will end. And so we should make those conditions comfortable for them, but we shouldn't pretend that it is reducing that, as she called it, toxic stress. It is still a tremendously brutal thing that we're doing to them, that we should all be ashamed of as Americans, I think.
I'd like to move now to the talk about anti-fascist movement, or Antifa, and anarchists. And you see this thread throughout history of scapegoating others. So Wheeler, aka the butcher in Cuba, said he was going after anarchists and unionists. Russia went after anarchists as well as others. Franco's Spain, Nazis called the Jewish anarchists embalmers, and the legacy of anarchist repression in the U.S. is long. Can you speak on new laws being proposed, such as the Antifa, anti-mask laws, or any thread of history with this?
Well, I have some opinions on that, but I am less of an expert on it, so I'll speak on it only in a limited way. Okay. The part that I feel like I can say something intelligent about. which is that this idea, it started out as the revolutionaries and the anarchists, and then it has evolved in the last 30 or 40 years into the terrorists, although you see even that word used in some of the camp systems I read about quite early on, but it wasn't used consistently the way it is today. I think we have to be very vigilant and dangerous as sort of consumers of news and people thinking about history. Just the general public needs to be, as well as scholars, and suspicious of any time there's this blanket term used for people to lump them into some identity that means we should give them fewer rights. Because historically, A, that leads to camps, which is really bad, and B, it neglects to address whatever the underlying issue is. If there are people bombing, if there are people executing civilians, if there are people, doing any of these things, those are bad things, and we need to find a way to fight them. But lumping them into generic terms more often than not leads to broad, lumped responses, which more often than not leads to clumsy tools that are ineffective. And I would put detention, this kind of mass detention, in as a key one of those kinds of things. And so there has always been legislation that targets this kind of stuff, and it is often reactive and unhelpful. And I certainly think we ought to find ways, if there are people planting bombs that are blowing up civilians, we need, our law enforcement needs to find ways to stop that. But by making it crimes, certain crimes specific to certain groups, and those penalties specific to certain groups, is a way that you start to have this two-tiered legal system. And as soon as you start having, all people are equal, but some people are more equal than others, to use Orwell's frame, you're taking rights away from somebody. And I think that's a tremendously dangerous precedent that often furthers the ends of the most radical members of a given group. And so without speaking to, the differences, let's say, between ISIS as terrorists and maybe the ANC, living in South African apartheid, and two groups that might have both embraced violence for very different reasons, if they get lumped under anarchists and terrorists and identified and targeted specifically for certain crimes in certain ways, I think that it isn't helpful. It isn't helpful to understanding what's actually happening on the ground. It isn't helpful to stopping certain acts. It doesn't help us think about the motivations of certain groups, which is really critical to understanding, what role those groups play. So I'm not for legislation that specifically targets particular groups. I think we do much better as a society when we have sets of laws that focus on very specific behaviors and have penalties for those behaviors, not penalties of association, because penalties of association is how you get to camps. Many people were put in camps by race or ethnicity, but just as many have been put in because of their political affiliations, because of their religious affiliations, and I just think that's not. Anytime you are prejudging or preemptively sentencing a group of people based on association, it usually means that you're being very lazy with your law enforcement.
Well, I was wondering if you were watching the August 4th Patriot Prayer Rally in Portland, and this where there was a lot of white nationalists and fascist supporters, and a member of the Proud Boys was wearing a shirt that was saying Pinochet did nothing wrong, and kind of this amnesia of history. Can you speak about the rise of the right-wing fascism in the U.S.? I think you already kind of touched on this a lot.
I touched on it, so I'll just answer briefly, but just to say that I don't want to tell the story of how it happened, but shortly after 9/11, there was a moment in which I realized my whole understanding of history was wrong. And it was part because stuff from Vietnam that I thought had been understood as discredited as strategy immediately appeared. And those experts were back, and they were arguing the same exact things that they had argued during Vietnam. And I was a very small child during Vietnam, and in my head, like studying the conflict and learning this and learning about the history and seeing how military policy had changed and the Powell Doctrine and all these things that had sort of reflected this, up until that point, I really sort of believed that things could be settled history. And So it wasn't related to the camp stuff at all, but in that moment I realized that there is no such thing as settled history. And it was a really transformational moment in my writing and in my understanding of the world, and I think has been really helpful in writing the camps book, but also in just living through our present moment. That realization that, of course, America wouldn't embrace Nazism. Of course, whatever follows that, of course, that you had in your head, just isn't true. Now, do I think a majority of Americans would embrace Nazism? Absolutely not. And did I already know that a small percentage of people were still active in this realm and felt that way? Of course. But the degree to which it could so forcefully re-enter popular discussion and talking points be parroted by the president on Twitter, even if he isn't always cognizant because he has no understanding of history at all, but that this stuff could just be immediately injected into the broader discourse in a very direct, open way, that's not hidden at all. That 20 years ago, that would have been shocking to me. I was fresh out of college, and I guess I really did think some things were settled history, but what we've learned is that none of this history is settled. And so that is why, one of the reasons I'm really happy that I've written this book, because I wanted to bring out some of these common themes and some of these ideas. It's exactly the things that we see floating around today. And in fact, when I was in Chile, there were lots of people who thought Pinochet had been fine, that Pinochet was no problem, that he had saved the country. These people don't go away. And I fear that with this sort of radical polarization that we're seeing in the U.S., when I was in Chile and Argentina, I found that because in both of those states it was the right, it was a military dictatorship of the right that had imposed itself on the country as a whole and persecuted the left, that these divides were incredibly difficult to transcend when it's one sort of whole side of the country against the other whole side of the country. That in places like Germany, where there was a defeat, there was a military defeat, the Constitution was rewritten, the society had to change in fundamental ways. But that didn't happen to that degree in Chile and Argentina. In Argentina particularly, it was the Falklands that triggered the end of the military dictatorship. It was that conflict. And so there was never an accounting, really. It is only now that they've been having, in recent years, they've been having these trials trying to do that. But I still found people on the ground very polarized. And you had some people saying, well, the left was so dangerous, the right had to do something, and that it was good that they did what they did. And the people on the left who are like, oh my God, they tried to kill us, they put us in camps, they executed us in the Escuela Mecánica, and so there's no common understanding of history there at all at this point. And you have it a little bit on the judicial side with the trials, but even the executive branch attention to it is very much a matter of politics rather than a matter of sort of shared accountability and understanding of this history. And the right has never taken responsibility for that, I think, in any profound way. And I fear that in the U.S., because we're a two-party system, if we were to move more wholesale into this kind of detention at some point, that would be our fate, that it would be very difficult to have that accountability and move past it, because there's not even a left and a right so much as Republicans and Democrats. And if right now, what's embracing this border detention and the harsher measures and the ICE actions and the multiple attempts at Muslim ban, it's really been, outside of a handful of senators from places like West Virginia, my home state, some of whom are Democratic, it's really been a Republican phenomenon. And I think that we're susceptible to this in a particularly bad way because we kind of only have two major parties that fight it out. We don't have a really robust multi-party system that might splinter up some of that and isolate the worst parts of what's happening right now. So I think that there's a real risk to what's going on.
Yeah, when you talk about the cycle of history, you were the first one who had brought this to my attention about the Nazis had Der Stürmer. In the newspaper, they would publish Jewish crimes.
Right.
And then the White House has set up a site for crimes, to highlight crimes by undocumented immigrants.
Right. They
cycle the history you show are important.
And I don't think, I think Stephen Miller is a very problematic person, and I think he is probably, along with a few other people, driving some of this immigration stuff that we're seeing. But it's a natural impulse when you want to control a group, when you want to get rid of a group, is that you demonize it. And so I don't necessarily think Stephen Miller is sitting up studying Nazi history, but he might be. But I don't think he has to be to have things going the way that they are, because it's, propaganda is now a century-old idea, and lots of people have looked at using it in different ways. And I think it's obvious that if you actually have a group that commits less crime than the average population, as immigrants do in the U.S., how can you make people afraid of them? Well, you can suppress the reports that show that they actually commit less crime, which has happened, and there's millions of them in the U.S. There are millions of undocumented people, and if they're just like you and me, they're going to commit some crime. So one way to make the general population frightened of immigrants is to find the worst crimes that you can find that have been committed by undocumented people, even if they're committing them in lower percentages per capita than the citizen population. You'll find some horrific crimes, and that's what we've seen with the Iowa University student who was killed, and then her death seems to be now being used as a propaganda tool, and her family seems to be taking a stand against that, which is good. But I actually wrote in February, I think it was, of 2017, that this is what was going to happen, that this is how this immigrant crime report that they were setting up would be used, that they would be looking for specific things. And of course, it's what the Nazis did. I'm sure it's happened in many other places. Certainly in the Soviet Union, there were counter-revolutionaries that were targeted through different kinds of publications and film too. This idea of isolating and highlighting people. And when it is an immigrant crime thing, you don't run the risk the way you do with people who are just political activists, that you have to then take a stand against them, or else you'll be perceived as one of them. We haven't reached that stage yet. For right now, it is focused on people without their papers. But I don't know if you've been seeing reports even in recent days. The Post, I think, just reported yesterday or the day before, the Washington Post, that people who were born along the border, some of them are having trouble getting their passports renewed, and they're having to, even though they're U.S. citizens and they have passports, they are having to prove all kinds of details about their childhood in order to try to get just documentation to travel. Yeah, and so the thing is, it always starts with some group that is legally regarded as an out group, and then this is the story of the camps from the beginning. As I said before, it goes from colonial outposts to then it's brought into the heart of Europe with the internment camps, and that version is milder, and nobody's going to these people's houses, refusing to renew their passports and shooting them. I mean, it's not going to be a mass executions we're going to read about next week, but it is the beginning of undermining. You start with the main group, and then you work at the edges of that. And so who's vulnerable? People who have Latino heritage, who are U.S. citizens but grew up along the border. Okay, so if you start delegitimizing their citizenship, then that would be a next step. Now, I haven't looked into this myself to see how widespread it is, or if it's just one person who's sort of, taking the initiative to do this, him or herself, or if it's a wider spread government effort. But typically these kinds of things have both. They both have zealots and enthusiasts who push the boundaries of what's official, and they have sort of, official efforts to broaden actions as well. So I'm not sure which basket this particular thing fits into now, but it's not unusual. You start with one group and then you move it out from there.
Thank you for tuning in. I highly recommend One Long Night. It is incredibly written, and it's history that needs to be known and discussed. Check out AndreaPitzer.com for her latest articles. She also has media up there. And as always, please rate the show, subscribe, share it around, and thanks to Awareness for the music.